Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. The skill and bravery of the Doolittle raiders who bombed Tokyo in 1942 captured the American public's imagination, but not all the crews came back. 8 US flyers became Japanese prisoners of war who were tortured, put on trial for war crimes and found guilty. Not all of these men would make it home. So in this episode, we're not going to be talking about the Doolittle raid per se, but rather focus on the post-war war crimes trial of a number of the Japanese officers who were connected with the treatment of the Doolittle flyers that became prisoners of war. Joining me is Michel Paradis, author of Last Mission to Tokyo. Michel is a specialist in international law and human rights and has worked for over a decade with the US Department of Defense. He's also a lecturer at Columbia Law School. But before I start, I'd like to take a moment to thank all those people who have become patrons of the podcast. They help me find the time to work on the show. I hope you guys find the extras that I make exclusively available to patrons interesting. If you've not already signed up, it's super simple. Go to patreon.com/WW2podcast. By becoming a patron, you commit to $1 or $2 each month, and in return you can bask in the rosy glow of satisfaction from helping me fund the podcast, whilst listening to the extras that I try to put out that are history related, but perhaps not specific to the current topic. So to find out more, go to patreon.com/WW2podcast and you'll find a short video of me there waffling on explaining how it works. Michel, thanks for joining me. I think our starting point must be to flesh out the Doolittle raid for those unfamiliar with it. It's very much the American response to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. How does it come about?
You have to remember 1942, especially the first half of 1942, is a total disaster for the Allies. You have Operation Barbarossa well underway. The Japanese have not only successfully attacked Pearl Harbor. For the United States, they've taken away the Philippines, which is the United States' largest colony. At that point, you have the Bataan Death March underway on the continent of Asia. The Japanese perimeter is pushing further and further into China. Shanghai has fallen. The Malaya Peninsula and Singapore have fallen. The Japanese, by the sort of spring and summer of 1942, are actually bombing Australia. And so, you have a very bleak moment in World War II, and the United States' entrance into the war is by no means a guarantee of success. And there's this desire, political as much as it is strategic, to show that the United States can not only should be and will fight this war, but has some chance of winning it. And then, if nothing else, has some chance of just punching the Japanese back in the nose. And so this plan, this completely impossible plan, gets floated. Well, why can't we get a bunch of bombers as close to Japan as possible on an aircraft carrier and then bomb Japan? And there are a whole bunch of just logistical reasons why this can't be done. First of all, time, weight, and fuel are just, pretty hard physical constraints. You can't land an Army bomber on an aircraft carrier, even if you could figure out a way of taking one or two off. And so it's just this essentially practicably impossible mission or idea. But Hap Arnold, who's the head of the U.S. Air Force at the time, taps Jimmy Doolittle, who's come on as his aide, who's just a lieutenant colonel at the time, and by no means a major presence in the U.S. military. In fact, he's a stunt pilot. That's what he's known for, is just being this kind of stunt pilot who comes up with ways of doing these crazy, impossible things. He was the first American to ever actually cross the continental United States in 24 hours. That was his first major claim to fame. But he would also do stuff where he would black out the windows of his airplanes and then take off and land to show that he could fly blind, which seems insane. But he actually has a PhD in what we would now call aeronautical engineering. So he's actually a real hardcore problem solver. He's an engineer as much as he is this kind of fancy stunt pilot. And so when he gets tapped for this, he's almost the perfect person in the U.S. Air Forces at the time to ask this, because he just does the math. He figures out the dimensions of the plane that you would need, how much fuel you would need to get so far, what kind of plane would actually be able to take off the 500 feet that's available to you on an aircraft carrier, and ultimately engineers a bunch of B-25B Mitchell bombers to be essentially flying gas cans with a couple of bombs attached to them. and does this incredible feat. He takes 80 men, 16 planes in all, on the aircraft carrier USS Hornet on a voyage in early April out towards Japan. They're expecting to do a night raid, but they get spotted by a Japanese picket boat, so they end up having to go 12 hours early, which means also about 1 to 200 nautical miles early, which is a big deal when you're trying to conserve fuel. And he takes off on this raid where everyone involved basically knows, or at least suspects in their more honest moments, like sleeping up, awake at night, that this is going to be a one-way mission. They're not. There's an effort to have a rendezvous point, or there's this plan to have a rendezvous point that Chiang Kai-shek is going to set up inside of China. But what Doolittle and the Raiders don't know is that doesn't actually materialize. And so they take off from the USS Hornet. They fly over targets in Kobe, Nagoya, and obviously Tokyo, and continue on to China looking for this rendezvous point and can't find it. And so all but one of Doolittle's 16 planes crash either into the East China Sea or into China after the crew bails out. One plane ends up diverting up into Russia and causing a bit of a diplomatic incident because at this point Russia's neutral in the war with Japan. But all the rest basically crash land into China and have to make their way out. And what makes the Doolittle raid miraculous is not only is it this just spectacular moment where the United States and the Allies basically punch Japan back in the nose and show that we're capable of striking back. We're capable of even potentially winning this war. Doolittle and all but 8 of the men who survive either are essentially held prisoner in Russia for the next year, but the remainder escape and rendezvous inside of China and become really some of the greatest heroes, certainly of the early period of the war. And if you ask anyone from the 1940s about the Doolittle Raiders, right, there's almost a mythic quality that persists to this day in people who know about it as, that was the moment we struck back. Because Doolittle not only, pulled off a suicide mission, he survived it. And so that's the setup, really, for the story. And what I got interested in was the story of the 8 guys who get captured by the Japanese.
So had the Japanese ever envisaged such a raid happening on them? What's their reaction?
So there were two basic things that gave the Japanese confidence that they were invulnerable to this kind of thing. One was they had this just national mythology of invulnerability, and it was not unreasonable. The main island of Japan literally had never been successfully attacked from abroad. Now there was some, when Commodore Perry dropped anchor in Edo Bay, they were probably about to get attacked from abroad had the Shogun not capitulated. But throughout its history, they had been more or less immune, certainly to land invasions of any kind, or any attacks inside of their country. The closest anyone had gotten was Kublai Khan, I think, who attempted a Normandy-style invasion of the coast, but whose flotilla was smashed asunder by a freak typhoon that had gone down in Japanese lore as the kamikaze. And so they had this just mythic sense, and practice through history that they just weren't going to be attacked. And the practicalities of 1942 certainly gave every reasonable, support to that. If you remember, it's 1942. The technology is such that the first trans-Pacific flight had only happened 10 years earlier. And that's because they basically turned this small little plane into a gas can and dropped its landing gear mid-flight because they needed to save weight. And it relied on sort of just this coasting in order to crash land into Oregon, right? So the idea that you could travel, certainly with any kind of payload as far as Japan, was just technically impossible. It was the very problem that Doolittle confronted and had to solve. Not the least because Japan had pushed its defensive perimeter very, very far out across the Pacific, down as far as Australia, deep into China, pushing into Burma. The Russians from the north were completely or ostensibly neutral. So, and then you have the Pacific Ocean as this just massive moat that can't be crossed. So Japan was totally justified in thinking they were invulnerable. And so when they actually got attacked, it was, I've tried to describe it to people, you got to be careful with analogies, obviously. But for the Japanese, it was much like September 11th was in the United States, right? This just, it's never happened here. Like, what kind of world is this? Like, you woke up in a totally different world where all of a sudden you are vulnerable to attack from abroad. It's a completely earth-shattering and psychologically shattering event for the Japanese.
With that in mind, you have these the 8 guys that are picked up. How are they initially treated when they're picked up?
So badly, I think is the only way to describe it. The first three of the guys survive a plane crash off the East China Sea. Two of their crew die in that crash, but are rescued and then initially taken in by some seemingly sympathetic Chinese guerrillas who quickly turn them over to the Japanese. And they're taken to Shanghai and tortured just brutally. All sorts of stress positions. Waterboarding is probably the most infamous of it. One of the characters who I tried to sort of tell a lot of this story through, Chase Nielsen, at one point they pin him to the ground and they put essentially a broom handle behind his knees, and then they bend his knees around this broom handle and start stomping on his thighs to essentially leverage the knee joints apart. It's utterly, as if you've ever had even a slight sports injury, you can imagine what that would have been like. Same thing for another crew, 5 guys who bail out over Nanchang. They're quickly rounded up, taken into custody by the Japanese Kempe Tai, and subjected to similar forms of abuse, more beating, but also waterboarding. And before long, they all get shipped off to secret prisons inside of Japan, where the torture continues. They're subjected to sleep deprivation, isolation. I think to a man, the ones who survived talked about the isolation really being, of all the tortures, the worst, right? The solitary confinement, the madness that comes from that. And it's a really harrowing story of, both human survival, but also just brutality on behalf of the Kempe Tai.
But then they're flown from, this was the slightly bizarre thing. They're flown from China to Tokyo, then back to China for because they are given a trial, aren't they? But I couldn't quite work out why they didn't remain in Tokyo.
Yeah, it's actually one of the great kind of mysteries of all this. And people, I remember reading, interrogation and questioning and affidavit after affidavit where people were trying to figure this out. And the closest I could come up with, based on the research, is that it was a hot potato. They didn't want them inside of Tokyo. Tokyo is the capital of Japan. It's where the war cabinet is. There's the most visibility about what's going on there. Shanghai, China is, further out into the hinterlands and this was, to me, a really big surprise. It's not something I was expecting when I started doing the research on this, is, what to do with those 8 Doolittle raiders was not a cut and dry matter for the Japanese cabinet. You have traditional, we would probably call them doves in the Japanese cabinet, like Foreign Minister Togo, who pushed for the ratification of the Geneva Conventions and failed, but at the very beginning of the war, essentially arm wrestled the cabinet into agreeing to comply in principle with the Geneva Conventions in terms of the treatment of Allied prisoners. And so you have this, very internationalist, rule of law oriented, small L liberal faction in the Japanese cabinet who have sway and political power. They're saying, look, we agreed to comply with the Geneva Conventions. We can't, torture and abuse prisoners. We have to just send the Doolittle raiders to a prisoner of war camp. But on the other side, you have hardliners. In the book, I put a lot of that, or sort of speak to that a lot through Hajime Sugiyama, who is the chief of staff of the army, who calls for their execution. Right, he wants them just executed as quickly and summarily and as publicly as possible as a deterrent. As far as he's concerned, they befouled the homeland. They threatened the Japanese population. There's a political valence to that too. Like the Japanese army failed to defend the homeland against the Doolittle raid. It took place in broad daylight. They flew low in over the city, and the Japanese army didn't shoot a single plane down. They barely grazed a few with flak. One of the reports I read from, I think it was an operational or tactical commander from the Japanese army, said they ended up doing more damage to Tokyo than the Doolittle raiders did, because they were firing these anti-aircraft guns in essentially an errant and wild way. And so they were damaging and causing more damage to Tokyo than certainly they did to the Americans. And so, there's a premium put on just blunt revenge, and the public is behind it. The Japanese public is largely behind it too, because very quickly the word goes out, and the Japanese propaganda around the raid goes out and says this is an act of terrorism. They flew over here to kill civilians, and that's what they did. They killed babies in their mother's arms. They gunned down children in schools. They shot our poor fishermen out in the water. This was blind terror bombing. This was an act of terrorism. And so the public desire to see these 8 Americans executed as publicly as possible was clearly there. And why they ended up getting sent back to Shanghai and why they ended up getting a trial at all actually turned as much on basically over clever lawyering and political compromise than anything else. Because what happens is, so Hideki Tojo is prime minister and war minister, but he's in this very precarious position. Like he's like, for your British audience, he's kind of like Theresa May or like John Boehner is who I typically use to describe him in the United States, right? He's not charismatic, but he's seen as this person that everyone who hates each other can barely live with, and that's good enough. And so he basically goes to the lawyers in the war ministry and says, look, we need to find a way of killing these guys that complies with international law. And the lawyers in the war ministry say, well, I'm sorry, you can't do that, right? You're literally describing something that violates international law. You can't kill prisoners. And the word goes back, though, and they say, no, you don't understand. If you don't come up with a way of doing this legally, the Kempe Tai are just going to off these guys and claim they tried to escape. And no one's going to believe it. And it's going to, cause this huge diplomatic incident. We have Japanese prisoners all around the world, not the least in the United States, who are at that very moment being held in internment camps. And so the lawyers come back and say, okay, well, if we try them as war criminals for atrocities against the Japanese, we can sentence them to death and then execute them. and that's what they do. They end up promulgating essentially an ex post facto law to prosecute the Doolittle raiders. And it's still quite controversial. And so what they end up doing is just ship them back to Shanghai to stand trial before this ex post facto law, so that no one inside of Tokyo essentially has their fingerprints on it.
So is it a show trial? There is no kangaroo court. There's no way they were going to get not guilty.
Oh yeah, the whole thing was written to convict them. I was actually amazed by the delicacy and detail that the Japanese lawyers went to try and make it look fairer than everyone kind of knew it was. And one of the characters who I read about, characters, these are real people, but one of the people I read about in the book is essentially a mid-level army lawyer by the name of Shoshin Ito, who gets this record. He's in Shanghai. He's ultimately the one who's going to be at least partially responsible for making sure this comes off without a hitch. And he looks at the evidence and he's like, look, we need more evidence. And so the Kempe Tai basically gives him the evidence he needs. And what that is some damage reports that ostensibly show damage to civilian targets, but also, and I think most damningly, confessions by the Doolittle raiders to committing atrocities by the Japanese that everyone knew, frankly, were tainted by torture. That's what the Kempe Tai did. But everyone knew to also look the other way. And so in August of 1942, they put the Doolittle raiders before this show trial. They used the confessions taken under torture. The witnesses who testified about the trial say it lasted about an hour. And there was nothing more to it than that. They, all were convicted as the law essentially ensured they would be. The law was written so that the only sentence they could be given was the death penalty. They were all given the death penalty. And soon they were all slated to be executed, except that the emperor, actually Tojo, intervened late to commute the sentences of 5 of them. So only the sentences were only actually ended up being carried out against 3. 3 were executed in October of 1942. So the basic allegations, or the most damning allegations against the Doolittle raiders, were claims that they had strafed civilians. And so they ended up affirming the death sentence against the gunner, the one surviving gunner. The gunner on the other plane died in the crash in the East China Sea. And then the 2 pilots as the stand-ins for, the individuals who are the most responsible for the conduct of their men. So those were the 3 men they executed. The 5 others were sentenced to life imprisonment under, quote, special conditions, which ended up being solitary confinement again. And they, spent the rest of the war in Japanese prisons in really, severe conditions of neglect, malnutrition. One ends up dying in December of 1943 of what's called wet beriberi. It's essentially a malnutrition disease. Another is almost dead by October of 1945, except that the OSS sends a rescue team to what is believed to just be another prisoner of war camp inside of China, Fengtai prisoner of war camp outside of Beijing. And in the course of liberating that camp, they stumble upon these secret prisoners, essentially these 4 secret prisoners who were being held there, who turn out to be, to everyone's shock and surprise, the Doolittle raiders. Because the Japanese, after they had executed the 3 men in October of 1942, informed the United States that they had executed the Doolittle raiders. And so everyone in the United States believes they're dead. And there's even a movie made about it in 1944, sort of a speculative piece of Hollywood fiction. It's a courtroom drama, actually, where the Doolittle Raiders are put on trial. It's called The Purple Heart, and it ends with the Doolittle Raiders all valiantly going to see their deaths at the hands of the villainous Japanese. And so, there was an idea of what happened that was pretty firmly in everyone's mind. So the idea that any of them were still alive at the end of the war was just, it was Lazarus. Here's Lazarus coming back from the dead.
FDR, Roosevelt had promised revenge or retribution along those lines for those responsible. I guess when you find actually that they're still alive, they have to be seen to fulfill that, presumably. I mean, was there still a mood to track down the Japanese responsible at the end of the war?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the end of the war is this fascinating period, which I'm fascinated by for a lot of reasons. But one of the biggest is that you have this kind of revolution in thinking about human rights. At the beginning of the war, at the Tehran Conference, Churchill writes in his diaries that when they discussed what to do with the captured Nazis, Stalin proposed coming up with a list of 50,000 Nazis and just shooting them. And FDR sort of, in his very FDR kind of way, sort of says, well, wouldn't 49,000 be enough? But Churchill, describes being revolted by this, but documents that people, have looked at over the past 5-10 years, and that have only come out really in the past 5-10 years, show that Churchill was opposed to trials. He thought, summary execution, at least for the top level Nazis, was a far preferable strategy. And history was behind him, right? History was behind Stalin. No one gave Napoleon a trial before he got sent off to Elba. But you had this idea that, no, we're going to individually hold the perpetrators of atrocities in war accountable as criminals in a courtroom. And that was a really kind of radical thing to do in a real courtroom with a real trial. And that was just such a radical thing to do, a radical rethinking about how a war was won, about what you owed to your defeated enemy. And that was just a really fascinating piece for me to be able to write about, especially as a lawyer who does war crimes law. That's my primary sort of area of practice. And to just see this moment in history that could have gone a lot of different ways, turn this way to sort of embrace concepts of the rule of law going back to Magna Carta, but even for a defeated enemy, was really just a revolutionary thing. And so that's ultimately, in large part, thanks to FDR, who was very, in favor of using trials to deal with the defeated enemy. And so when the captured Doolittle Raiders are liberated, and they're found alive, and they have a story to tell, a story of real torture and abuse and really murder, they almost become poster boys for this movement to use trials, to hold those people who are responsible individually and personally guilty, frankly, to get death sentences. To get revenge, but to do it with, at a minimum, the patina of legality. But I think what's remarkable about this period, and that's why I kind of enjoyed writing about it, was with actually a pretty significant degree of legality, right? This wasn't just, these weren't just like the Americans doing an eye for an eye, right? Just having, you had the show trial for the Doolittle Raiders, we're going to have a show trial for the people who tortured and murdered the Doolittle Raiders. No, there was actually this genuine, earnest effort to make these trials about as fair as you could.
Well, I tell you what, it intrigued me, and I might be wrong here, and it's Robert Dwyer, isn't it, who's the prosecuting the case against the Japanese. He leads the investigation. That struck me as being, shouldn't it have been a job for military police or something? It seems almost quite inquisitorial as opposed to adversarial form of justice.
Yeah, it is. It's this. Well, so there was initially an FBI agent who was stationed in China who did some of the initial investigation, but he came up with this file, and that file was then given to Robert Dwyer, and Robert Dwyer was asked, "Can you make this into a case?" And the short answer was, maybe, because the problem with the Doolittle Raiders is, the case against the Japanese for torturing and murdering the Doolittle Raiders, as you probably can guess from everything I've already said, is basically everybody was responsible, right? You could go all the way down to the goons for the Kempe Tai who tortured the Doolittle Raiders and put them on trial. Okay, but then what about the people one level up and one level up to there, or the emperor, right? The emperor who personally decided whether or not certain of the Doolittle Raiders should be executed, right? He clearly understood there was a need to temper what was being done, yet he still allowed the execution of these three men to go forward. Why isn't the emperor on trial for the murder of the Doolittle Raiders? And so Dwyer, as a lawyer, actually ends up really becoming, he's faced with this really difficult problem. So FDR, right, says those most responsible for the torture and murder of the Doolittle Raiders should be tried. So who is responsible? What does it actually mean to be responsible? So he struggles with that. It's not an easy question. He runs himself all over Asia, basically, trying to figure out who is responsible, how he can prove in court that this or that person is actually responsible in a legal sense for the torture and murder of the Doolittle Raiders. One of the fascinating things, at least for me as a lawyer, that he ends up hitting upon is the people he ends up deciding are the most responsible are the lawyers. And that's what makes this case just totally fascinating and precedent-setting in so many different ways, is that whether or not high or low, he sees this show trial that the Japanese conduct in August of 1942 as the fulcrum. It launders all the evidence of torture that the Kempe Tai had been beating out of these guys for the previous 4 or 5 months, but it also justifies, everything that happened to them afterwards. The executions could not have happened without that show trial. The solitary confinement, the one who dies in custody of malnutrition, wouldn't have happened without that show trial. And so he rounds up, basically hunts down the lawyers and the judges and puts them on trial, in essence, for putting on an unfair trial. And so the cumulative effect of that is that in 1946, March, April 1946, the United States Army in occupied Shanghai ends up conducting the trial of a trial. And it's just this remarkable, turn of the screw. It's this remarkable human drama of these mid-level army officers, some of whom are not even lawyers, debating in this really earnest and impassioned way, what is justice? What do we owe our enemies? All of the really, fascinating sort of heady questions that kind of drove me to this period all end up getting literally litigated in this U.S. Army courtroom in Shanghai in 1946.
Hey, it's a great courtroom. It is a great courtroom drama. I wonder if we hear about. It got me thinking about the German rat lions. The Germans were on the run and they were fleeing to Argentina. Did they when it came to evidence for the trial? I mean, were the Japanese record takers? Did they keep everything on paper? Had they destroyed it all? Did people realise that they were up for possible conviction and go into hiding or go on the run? I mean, how helpful were the Japanese?
Yeah, it's a fascinating piece of this. Is the Japanese, not unlike the Germans in this respect, right? So really bureaucratic. Like, they make paperwork really comprehensively, and they knew. Certainly after the Potsdam Declaration. So, obviously in July of 1945, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration for the conditions under which Japan's surrender will be accepted. And a key piece of that is the liability, the personal liability of Japanese who are responsible for atrocities, including, and most especially, against prisoners. And so very quickly after that comes down, after the armistice is declared on August 15th, they start burning a lot of records. There are bonfires and bonfires of records that get burned. And people kind of go into hiding or quietly, leave the army and find something else to do. One person who I write about briefly, I think, in the book, was one of the most infamous torturers for the Kempe Tai in China, a guy named Miki. In the sort of final year of the war, he basically leaves the army and then just goes to live in Shanghai, in Japantown, which is this very, about 80 to 100,000 Japanese are living in this part of district in Shanghai. And people are on the hunt for him after the war, and they can't find him. And it turns out, and they're looking all over the world for him. They're looking in Japan, they're looking throughout China, they're looking in the other sort of parts of Southeast Asia. And it just turns out he's living around the corner from everybody in Shanghai, because he just sort of very quietly, picked up with his wife and lived under an alias, as a peaceable citizen in Japan. And so in the Doolittle raid case, it's a huge problem, figuring out who is responsible for what. The documents have significantly been burned, and it's likely that none of them, no one really responsible, none of the lawyers that end up getting tried would have been found at all had it not been for another Japanese lawyer who had come to be deployed in Shanghai with the 13th Army, which is the division of the Japanese China Expeditionary Army that is responsible for the trial and execution of the Doolittle raiders. He comes in 1943 or 1944 and finds a copy of the records involving the Doolittle raiders. And he's, just a normal citizen of Tokyo. So he remembers the Doolittle raid just as from the vantage point of the ground. And then when he sees it's this record, he's just curious about it and keeps an eye on it. And so when records start getting burned in August of 1945, he kind of squirrels a couple copies away, including the names of the people, like the lawyers and the judges who were involved. He says he did this in part because, it was a historic document, and he understood that, and he didn't want it to be destroyed. But he also understood that if the documents pointing to specific people, like that record of trial, if those got destroyed, what would prevent the Americans from kind of doing what I think a lot of people expected, right? Just mass executions. What was proposed by Stalin, right? If you can't find the individuals who are actually responsible, well, then everyone becomes responsible, and there's this kind of guilt by association. And so he had this acute sense of that, and so preserved it as literally evidence against his own people. And then turned it over to the Americans and said, this is what you're looking for, which is kind of this amazing stroke of luck, ultimately, that they were able to get that judgment, the judgment papers in place, which name names.
Somebody obviously has to act for the defence of it to be a fair trial. So who gets chosen for the defence? I mean, was the defence chosen or appointed?
They were appointed, and by and large, reluctantly. Whatever our norms about like fair trials, particularly for enemies, are today, being the defense lawyer for the Japanese was not something most American officers were keen to do in 1946. The Australians were conducting their own war crimes trials throughout the South Pacific at this point, and they didn't put their officers in that position. The Japanese got Japanese lawyers to represent them in the trials. But the Americans just had this sense of, no, we got to give them American lawyers. If nothing else, like American lawyers will understand the system. So if you're going to have a fair trial, you need to have a lawyer who actually knows what's going on. But they weren't that, let's be candid, they weren't that committed to the idea. And in the Doolittle raid case is probably the biggest case in point because, you had one of the lawyers who got tapped was essentially a young lawyer named Charles Fellows, who's 33, if I'm remembering, looked like a Boy Scout. He looked barely old enough to join the Army, let alone be a 33-year-old lawyer. He just was very keen to get back home to Oklahoma. So he kind of agreed because if he figured that if I represent the Japanese, I'll get a couple extra points so that I'll be on the next flight back home. I'll finally get out of the Army. He got drafted. He didn't want to be there in the first place. But that also presented the Americans with a big, if nothing else, an optics problem. The guy who put the case together is a major. The case is actually being formally led by a fairly swashbuckling American lawyer by the name of John Hendren, who's a lieutenant colonel. So they need someone who's at a minimum above the rank of captain to represent these guys. And so they end up tapping a guy named Edmund Bodine, who's a major at the time, but he's up for promotion to lieutenant colonel, so it looks better. But the problem with Ed Bodine is he's not a lawyer. he's a pilot. And the only reason he is willing to take on the case at all is because he's fallen in love with the concierge at the bachelor's officers' quarters the Americans have set up inside of Shanghai. And so you have a guy who kind of looks the part, right? He's a dashing looking, American pilot. But he had gone to a little bit of night school, apparently failed out or did not get good grades good enough to graduate from law school, which is why he becomes a pilot in the first place. And he's taking on the case essentially for entirely inappropriate or the wrong reasons, right? He understands, I think, at a certain level that he's there to lose. That's his job. And he's there to look good while losing. But that also just gives him a reason to stay in Shanghai. He's kind of the opposite of his co-counsel. He wants to stay in Shanghai because he wants to be with his girlfriend. And that's initially, at least, the kind of sorry state of the defense that the Americans give the Japanese.
They do due diligence, and they do find holes in the prosecution case, don't they?
They do.
To pick at.
Yeah, that's sort of like, to me at least, and maybe I'm, as a lawyer, you find this sort of thing especially inspiring. But it is really this triumph of a certain kind of fairness and in good faith, actually, is the word I would use for it. Because you have Ed Bodine, right, doesn't really want to be there. It's basically an excuse to get what he wants out of Shanghai. And he gets this case. He meets with these Japanese clients, right? But for the grace of God, he just had been a little too old to be one of the Doolittle Raiders himself. But, had he been just slightly younger or joined the Air Corps slightly earlier, he would have probably at least been eligible to join the Doolittle Raid. So he could have been the one executed, in October of 1942 or tortured by the Kempe Tai. But nevertheless, he meets with his clients, these, disgraced Japanese officers, and he listens to them. And he actually takes this mandate he ends up getting of being responsible for their lives, to be their advocate in this trial. He ends up taking it seriously, which is an incredible thing. And so he and his co-counsel end up going to Japan to investigate the case. And they end up finding that there's a case there, right? They actually have a defense. It's a defense that almost certainly will, and in truth does, end their military careers. But they ultimately decide that, their obligations, their duty in this situation is to represent their former enemies, and to give them the defense that they would want to be given if they ever found themselves in enemy hands, whether it was Japanese or German or, you name the enemies we confront today. That's why before, maybe when I said, what to me just made the book really enjoyable to write and inspiring in these very cynical times in which we live is you have Robert Dwyer, who's, again, very smart but a very flawed lawyer. You have Edmund Bodine, who's not a lawyer at all, doing everything for, marginally acceptable reasons. But at the end of the day, they both really just commit themselves to what they think is fair. And I even in writing it, people have commented, and some of the people who've reviewed it sort of comment that the book goes back and forth a bit in terms of who you think should win or how they should. And that was really satisfying, actually, to just see two people of good faith having a good faith argument about principles.
Well, I think the difficult thing for the defence is they actually, when they get the evidence that the school has actually been attacked, there's some school kids were killed by random strafing, which the Doolittle Raiders say didn't happen. They have to sort of go, well, it did happen. You guys as heroes are lying. We have the evidence that it happened. And that's a very ballsy thing to do, is to accuse an American hero that he's wrong when you're... that's what I find absolutely incredible about the case.
And not just to do it, but in 1946, right? This is not the comfort of, from the vantage point of history. This is real time. These are real people who had just lived through all of this. The emotions were still raw about the war. My grandfather, who fought in World War II, never drove a Japanese car for the remainder of his life.
No, did my father.
Yeah, right. So, these are really raw emotions. And that willingness to say, no, the truth is more complicated, was just a remarkable, remarkable act of character under incredible political and professional and even just social, strain. That it was really, I don't know, it just made it a much more satisfying book to write about than it might have been had it been a more straightforward legal analysis.
Joe, if we look at the trial, is it a trial? Because there's no jury, is it? It's a panel of military officers. Are they legal military officers, or do they just sort of get co-opted on?
Co-opted on entirely. But that actually was not atypical in the U.S. military at the time. It was that's what a court-martial actually would look like. It's
just so high profile. I kind of thought, I wonder if they just co-opted on. I don't know if I'd want to be on, just co-opted onto such a high-profile case.
Yeah, I don't. It's a great question. Would you want to be a juror on that case? I think certainly the judges did not want to be. Here's actually what I think happened, and I don't say this in the book, but I think, just looking at it and knowing it, I think everyone knew the outcome from the beginning, right? They quote unquote knew the outcome from the beginning, right? This was not the first war crimes trial. It was actually the third or fourth war crimes trial to take place in the Pacific. The Nuremberg tribunals had just started in Europe. But the first war crimes trial to take place in the Pacific was the case of General Yamashita, and that's taking place in Manila. And what MacArthur does is he puts the defeated Japanese general for the Battle of Manila on trial I think the trial begins actually in October of 1945. So very quickly. And Yamashita's trial is a unquestionable railroading, right? It is barely a trial. And the judges on the trial certainly understood what their job was to do, was to convict Yamashita under a legal theory that was entirely new. In fact, it's so new that the U.S. Supreme Court ends up taking up Yamashita's case and reviewing it just because it seems at best marginal. And so they ultimately uphold it. But, there's a lot of novelty going on in the trial of General Yamashita, and everyone knows what the score is, right? There's no doubt about how Yamashita's trial is going to end. Not unlike there was no doubt about how the Doolittle Raiders trial was going to end. To sort of put a capstone on that, General Yamashita is convicted, for atrocities in the Battle of Manila, which were horrific. Don't get me wrong, but he was convicted on December 7th, 1945. Right, that's the Pearl Harbor Day. Right, no one had a doubt that this was, like Caesar hanging his enemies. His defeated enemies in the public square. And so I think when the Doolittle Raider trial got started, and the American trial of the Japanese who murdered and tortured the Doolittle Raiders got started in April of in 1946, I don't think anyone really reasonably assumed that the outcome or the trial itself would be all that different. I think everyone expected the same kind of summary justice to satisfy the public's desire for revenge. And what made the trial unique, actually, or not unique, because a lot of other of the trials that followed, I think showed a just as remarkable effort at fairness and equanimity and actual justice than this one did. And so what made this trial kind of remarkable is that all the people involved actually committed to making it a fair trial. And it probably, I don't think it's unfair to say, it's probably the first fair trial of the post-war period, because the handful of precedents that came before were by no means something that we would be proud of today.
Well, I did wonder. I did make a note that I wonder if they felt the pressure of the precedents that we're setting. Obviously, the political situation across the world's changing by 46, and I wonder if that was very much on their minds while they were sitting there. Did they need to consider that perhaps if the tables were turned at some point in the future, and that was Americans on trial, if they really did have to be seen to be fair.
Yeah, I think there was this sense of history on the Doolittle Raid trial, and maybe that was because of the changing politics. I mean, one of the many fascinating things about the immediate post-war period is how quickly all the politics changed and how the world changed. Right, you had this kind of etch-a-sketch moment for all of the alliances and political expectations that everyone had up until that point, and so this brief period from 1945 really to 1947 is everyone's just trying to figure out what the world is going to be like from now on. And you have the beginning of the Cold War, the Civil War in China, which is happening all around this trial, is beginning to pick up steam between Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party, the People's Liberation Army. And so, I think there was this, without being grandiose about it, I think there was actually this genuine sense of history, and not just history, but like responsibility to history, right? I think everyone understood at that moment to a certain extent, and they almost come close to saying this at various points, that they know that the future is going to look back at what they're doing as precedent. And so that they were as much in the business of making the future's past as they were trying to just, do the daily work of trying this case and figuring out exactly what happened. There was this weight of history, both the history from behind them that they were trying to live up to, like the ideals they had fought the war for, the four freedoms, but also, this sense that they are going to be a part of history that is going to shape the future. And they did, right? That's what's kind of remarkable, is they took that obligation really quite seriously.
You said the verdict's almost a foregone conclusion of sort of being guilty, but that's not really the verdict, is it? It's sort of the verdict's guilty but not guilty. How do we get to that verdict?
No, and that's sort of the crazy thing, right? Everyone's expecting this to be just like Yamashita's trial, right? A couple of weeks in court, a conviction on all counts, a death sentence to swiftly follow. And the result is not that at all, right? The judges take their responsibility just as seriously as the lawyers, which is kind of I think just as important of a lesson about all this. And they end up convicting everybody, right? I don't think anything short of a literal conviction would have, that's asking a little too much, probably, of even the most sturdy wills in 1946. But one of the remarkable things they do is, for at least a few of the defendants, they find them not guilty of essentially essential pieces of the crimes, right? They say, we find you guilty of the charge. However, we don't find you guilty of what we in sort of legal parlance call the elements of the charge. And so it's like saying, we find you guilty of stealing, but we find you not guilty of taking property that is not yours. And in response to that, they give them what were seen at the time as ludicrously light sentences. All of them get about 4 to 5 year sentences, except for the one who was actually a Japanese lawyer. He was who had gone to law school. He was given a 9-year sentence because he should have known better, but still well short of the death penalty that everyone was expecting. And it was a public outrage. You had members of Congress, the heads of committees, like the Judiciary Committee, insisting that hearings be held to determine whether the trial should be conducted a second time, whether or not there were essentially errors and mistakes made by the judges, the American judges and the American lawyers, that allowed this, what was seen to be perversion of justice, essentially excessive leniency to the defeated Japanese, who were responsible for killing some of the most celebrated American heroes of the entire war, whether or not they should be tried again, to finally get a death sentence this time.
But is it like saying, we accept you had command responsibilities, you're responsible, but we haven't reached the end of the command responsibility, it's above that, and that is beyond the purview of the court? There
was a little bit of that. There was certainly a sense that Dwyer's decision to go after the lawyers, to go after the middle, as opposed to the top or the bottom of those most responsible, seemed to let certain people off the hook, or at least temporarily. And to be sure, when the Tokyo Tribunal gets underway later that year, some of the charges against some of the individuals, including Tojo himself, are for the mistreatment of the Doolittle Raiders. So it's not the end of the Doolittle Raiders story. But the verdicts and the sentences especially go beyond that, right? Because Yamashita, certainly as a matter of command responsibility, was not the only person responsible for what happened, the atrocities that happened in the Battle of Manila. Quite the opposite. Right, most of the atrocities committed in the Battle of Manila were actually done by not the Japanese army under Yamashita's command, but the Japanese Navy. Yet that didn't absolve, there were people higher up than Yamashita who certainly bore responsibility for Manila. But there was this sense that, right or wrong, and I think we can debate the Yamashita case endlessly, but there was this sense that Yamashita did deserve the gallows for not playing a more responsible part in the chain of command to prevent atrocities. And all of those legal theories, in fact, literally the Yamashita precedent, command responsibility, was used in the Doolittle Raiders case against the Japanese who were on trial. But I think the conclusion ultimately came down to a couple different things. I think on the one hand, the fact that the defense was willing to challenge the mythology of the Doolittle Raid in court had an impact on the verdict. It made the trial much more complicated and much more about the truth, but it sort of focused people's minds on that this is something that happened, and we have to think about this as real life. This isn't a fairy tale. I think also it wasn't just that there were other people responsible who were just at the same level, shall we say, as the people on trial, who the prosecutors, in their zeal to kind of make a quick and tidy case against the Japanese lawyers, missed. And I think that had a huge impact, actually, on the verdict, is that there was this, the desire to hold people responsible and missing some of the people who were clearly the most responsible certainly created it certainly created sort of, I think, a tension in everyone's mind that if you're not going to prosecute and sentence these people to death, which is what essentially they had failed to do, it certainly seems grotesque, or at least unjust, to hold these other men who were less culpable comparatively to the same severe punishment. And so I think that had a big part of it too.
I wonder, with the passage of time, how that court verdict's now viewed. Is it still taught in universities around the world or in the US? Is it upheld as being fair, probably the correct decision?
So the ironic thing is that it's largely, almost if not entirely, prior to this book, forgotten. And there are two reasons for that. One is, I think, the very ambiguity in the verdict made it something that seemed not like the Yamashita verdict, right, where you have a dead defendant at the end, right? There's something less clear about that. So Yamashita ends up getting studied far, far more than the Doolittle raid case, in part, too, because the Supreme Court took up the case. Had the Supreme Court taken up the Doolittle case, I'm sure we'd probably study it a little bit more than we do. So there's kind of a ambiguity about the verdict and about what it says, too, about the United States, right? There were a lot of harsh truths that came out in the course of the trial, which, I think are still uncomfortable for a lot of people to reckon with. But I think the other important fact that people that made this case had sort of lost to history is that it set so many precedents, because it set those precedents in a sense so well that they became part of the Geneva Convention. And so things like denying a fair trial, things like torture, things like denying prisoner of war privileges to prisoners of war, things like the use of solitary confinement are all now expressly forbidden in the Geneva Conventions. And so when learning international law governing, the treatment of prisoners, you look to the Geneva Conventions and that's full stop. That's where you stop. You don't need to go further than that. It's clearly wrong. And it's kind of a funny story. The only reason I ever came across this case at all was I was working in the Department of Defense at the end of the Bush administration, and there was an ongoing debate, as you might remember, about whether or not waterboarding constituted torture. And we had heard, I think through, it might have been a law professor who had written an article, mentioned this case as a case in which what was said was that we had prosecuted the Japanese for waterboarding. And that obviously seemed very relevant and important to deciding whether or not waterboarding was torture. And so I remember that's what led. So we sent a young Marine captain out to the National Archives to find this case. And they end up pulling this old dusty record of trial out of the National Archives and making a copy for us. And I remember reading it one afternoon and just having my eyes peel back. I couldn't believe, first of all, it was about the Doolittle Raiders. And so that point had gotten obscured and lost. And I had never known that there was this trial of the men responsible for torturing and murdering the Doolittle Raiders. But then so many of the very issues that were being debated quite heatedly in the context of the war on terrorism, about everything from the use of torture to what justice we owe our enemies, all of these questions that we were treating as completely new, and how are we going to comply with the Geneva Conventions? Or they had all been there. They were all there in 1946, and I felt like I was looking just across the sands of time at the present day, as people really were wrestling with the very same issues that we were wrestling with back in 2007.
Yeah, and I think the other interesting thing about it, I might be wrong, but there seemed to be not a vast amount of direct meddling by MacArthur, who is sort of almost deciding who he wants to put on trial and who he doesn't want to put on trial, and he's sort of got his fingers in things, hasn't he? And it seems to be almost let go as a backwater. Oh, it's going to be held in China. So it sort of plays out in its own sort of way.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to that. There's also an element to it as well, which I explore a little bit in the book. One of the more controversial pieces, certainly at the time it was extremely controversial, history I think has largely been sympathetic to his judgments on this, is that MacArthur certainly not only had this policy or how would you call it? I wouldn't quite call it a policy, but certainly a habit of trying his former adversaries as war criminals and executing them, which didn't leave a good taste in a lot of people's mouths, even at the time. But he also had a way of playing favorites with people who were quite culpable and essentially immunizing them from potential exposure to war crimes prosecution. Most notoriously or famously, depending on your point of view, was his essential absolution of Emperor Hirohito. And he was, in a sense, certainly in his private papers, publicly it was a little more, put on, but certainly in his private papers, far more frank about the fact that he was doing it solely for the purpose of political stability, right? Hirohito could have personally called for Pearl Harbor, and MacArthur would have essentially let him off the hook and given him the political cover in order to create the kind of legitimacy and political stability that MacArthur was seeking as part of the reconstruction of Japan. And that's true in the Doolittle raid case, too. He actually ends up protecting individuals who are at least as implicated, I'll say, as some of the other people on trial, in part because they had become indispensable to him as part of the reconstruction program in Japan.
But they're also in Japan, so he has control over them as well.
That's right. He's in there. He can make sure that they don't get shipped off to Shanghai, China.
Well, as we're starting to drift away from the original topic, it's perhaps a good place to finish. Thanks, Mitchell. I enjoyed that very much. Folks, if you want a blow-by-blow account of the trial, the book is Last Mission to Tokyo. I think you'll find it a gripping read. It's interesting to see all the arguments a post-war war crimes tribunal had to deal with. So next time out, we're still in the Pacific and we'll be looking at Guadalcanal. So that's all from me. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.